The Italian seems to have had two things particularly in view of his farming: whether the land would yield a fair return for the investment in money and labor, and whether the situation was healthful or not. If either of these elements is lacking, any man who, in spite of that fact, desires to farm has lost his wits and should be taken in charge by his kinsmen and family. So if anybody's out there farming ground that is not profitable, Varro says that you've lost your wits and should be taken by your kinsmen and family. My name is Jack Washburn, and today I'm going to be talking about ancient texts on agriculture. From ancient China to ancient Greece and Rome, there are 1,000-year-old texts that describe practices that modern science is coming to the same conclusion today. So this first example is from ancient Greece in 300 BC. When Aristotle died, he left his library, his manuscripts, and his school to a student from the island of Lesbos. And the student was named Theophrastus. Theophrastus, over the next 30 years, wrote two key books that are the earliest books in European botany. And in them, he details exactly how legume cover cropping and nitrogen fixation works before we even knew what nitrogen was. And they got down to termination timing at flowering. Now we know that that has to do with the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the plant and ideal mineralization timing of that nitrogen. But back then, they had no idea. So Theophrastus starts, he says, beans are not burdensome to the ground. In fact, they seem to manure it. So he was making a comparison between applying manure to planting beans and not harvesting them, which to me seems wild that they would think to not harvest something that they've grown unless they know that it's helpful. So at some point, they found out that if you grow them before cereal crops, the cereal crops do better. But they grew them, and they waited for them to flower, and then they terminated them. And they even talk about the pros and cons of allowing for more time in between termination to planting and how the vigor of the subsequent crop is based on that timing. And in his next book, he goes and lays out that all legumes help the subsequent crop. And he even goes to show that some specific cover crops, as we call them, like chickpeas, suppress certain weeds. So he was finding, just through observation and trial, things that we know now as allelopathy and nitrogen fixation and nitrogen mineralization and carbon to nitrogen ratios, all without having any of the words for that. Now today, we know that nitrogen in the air is N2. It's not able to be taken up by the plant except through a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium in the soil. And that if we pull up a legume and we cut open the nodule, if it's pink inside, we know that nitrogen fixation is taking place. We know that those rhizobium are working with the legume to take that N2 from the atmosphere and convert it into the nitrogen that the plants can use. Thousands and thousands of years prior to us figuring that out, the exact same practices were being done in agriculture across the world. A century later, Cato the Elder wrote De Agricultura, or On Agriculture, the oldest complete work of Latin prose. And I'm going to read just a couple lines from it. It is true that to obtain money by trade is sometimes more profitable, were it not so hazardous, and likewise money lending, if it were as honorable. And when they would praise a worthy man, their praise took this form: good husbandman, good farmer. It is from the farming class that the bravest men and the sturdiest soldiers come. Their calling is most highly respected, their livelihood is most assured, and is looked on with the least hostility, and those who are engaged in that pursuit are least inclined to be disaffected. So the oldest known piece of Latin prose from Cato the Elder holds the farmer in the highest esteem, and that seems to be the case throughout all ancient texts. In the year 60 AD, a farmer in Spain named Columella wrote in a letter that the aristocrat Roman landowners were complaining that their soils were degrading and the weather was turning. They were completely wrong, and that the issue is not the weariness of the soil or the old age of the soil, but of the lack of the energy of the Roman landowners. He says, the earth is quickened by frequent and timely manure applications. Thousands of years before we learned what water extractable organic carbon was, or organic matter percent measured in a lab. He went into the military and traveled around in the army, and eventually settled just outside of Rome, where he owned a bunch of farms. He bought a bunch of farms, and he details his trials he ran. He took detailed field notes on all of his field trials that he was running to figure out what rates of manure he should apply from his animals, and what type of this chalky substance, when applied to his olive orchards, would yield a crop response. In his second book, he gives you 3 ways to find out what type of ground you're standing on. He says, 1, take clods from the part of the field you like the least. Soak them in a jar of fresh water, strain it like cloudy wine, and taste it. Whatever comes through is the taste of that soil, bitter or salty, and you found your problem. That first test that we were talking about is a standard salinity test. And so he takes that clod and he soaks it in water, and then he drinks it and tastes it to figure out if it's salty or not. Right now, a lab runs a saturated paste analysis to give us the salinity. Second, he says, wet a clod and work it in your hand. If it's sticky, holds together, and doesn't shatter when you throw it down, there's fat and moisture in it. And then the second one is texture by feel. You take a clod of soil and you rub it between your fingers. In NRCS field guides today, that is still an example of ways you can test the physical texture of your soil. 3, he says, dig a trench and then try to put the soil back into it. If there's more soil than the hole, it's rich. And if it's less when you put the soil back in the hole, the soil is poor. Digging a hole and refilling it with the soil you dug is testing bulk density. You know, how well that soil can hold moisture and what its aggregate stability is, and bulk density is all found thousands of years ago with this guy in all of his fields running his trials. And he details out in his book to keep 2 manure pits, 1 for aging and 1 for applying. And he says you need to age the manure for a year. And so now we know that that's compost, and it's composting manure to apply so it's not hot and burn the crops. And so he goes on basically like an agronomist, helping the farmers around him rebuild the soil of their lands as they've been degrading. All of this knowledge on these practices of building organic matter, of planting legume cover crops for nitrogen fixation, and for even liming recommendations for improving soil structure, were all documented thousands of years ago. All right, so I'm gonna read a little bit from De Re Rustica. So this is the one book that survived. He wants to make sure that even when he's dead, people know how to make an estate profitable by good cultivation practices. And then in this book, he lays out all of it. The Italian seems to have had 2 things particularly in view of his farming: whether the land would yield a fair return for the investment in money and labor, and whether the situation was healthful or not. If either of these elements is lacking, any man who, in spite of that fact, desires to farm has lost his wits and should be taken in charge by his kinsmen and family. So if anybody's out there farming ground that is not profitable, Varro says that you've lost your wits and should be taken by your kinsmen and family. He's saying that you're a crazy person if you can't make a farm profitable, and that your ability to hold your family name was through how good of a farmer you were. Now we're going to go to ancient Rome in 77 AD, where Pliny the Elder was a commander of a cavalry fleet. He took time to write 37 books trying to aggregate all of Roman knowledge about the natural world. So Pliny the Elder documents that the Romans would dig from these specific pits of clay that contained lime, and they would apply it to their fields. The Gauls would dig out the substance called marl. He said that it made the ground much more fertile, and they would have to apply it at a certain amount of time every few years or so, and he even had rates and rate recommendations on their equivalent of our pounds or tons per acre of applying this chalky substance to ground. So he says open them up and make them more fertile, similar to how currently we have lime. Pliny the Elder writes that there are different types of these materials you can dig up and apply, in that they are characterized by their ability to break down, and that the ones that break down more have more use, similar to how we look at ag lime and how the fineness corresponds with the ability for it to break down and change pH in our current soils. He also mentions that an over-application of these substances chokes the soil, which we know that over-applications of lime lead to micronutrient tie-up and phosphorus immobilization. He's just saying it 2,000 years ago, which is wild. I'm gonna talk about the Chinese tax system, where they classified land based on color and soil quality to then tax them. Because that's something that, we have Farm Service Agency and, the Risk Management Agency that still does stuff like that today. So in the Tribute of Yu, this ancient Chinese document, there's a quote that says, "Its soil was white and mellow, its fields were of the medium 5th grade, and its tribute was ranked in the 1st grade, best paying province in the empire on middling ground." And then it repeats a formula of soil classification 9 times: blackish and rich, red, clayey and rich, miry, greenish and light, yellow and mellow. And so in this book, every province gets its soil described by color and texture and how water sits, and then a field grade and a tax grade. And then the farmers of that land are taxed based on these soil characteristics according to this ancient document. And the thing is, it's like the properties that they picked, the color and the texture and the water holding capacity, are probably the best that they could have picked. So things like well-draining soil keeps iron oxidized. And so the color is mostly iron, so the reddish to gray to black. It's a chemical record of how much oxygen that soil receives, how saturated with water, how well it drained, or if it's anaerobic or aerobic. Now we have soil survey crews that look at soil and they compare it to like a Munsell chart with hue and intensity. And so we do basically the same thing today. We record the texture and the color and the drainage class, and we find the restrictive layer and the slope, and those all get turned into pieces on a map that are used oftentimes for purposes like Farm Service Agency or with NRCS and just overall looking at like USGS land survey. And they were doing that in ancient China thousands of years ago with basically the exact same soil properties of color and texture and drainage and slope. And that's what they used to tax the citizens that were farming on that land. From Varro in Rome in 36 BC. He almost died before he could write this, it says. He commanded an army for Pompey against Julius Caesar, but had to surrender. Caesar pardoned him twice. They put him in charge of building Rome's first public library. Over his life, Varro wrote more than 74 separate works, or around 600 individual books, everything from law, astronomy, geography, education, literary history, satire, and poetry and speeches. And only one of them survived, and it's a farm manual. A lot in there is estate management, where to put your house, where to start a farm, where not to start a farm. And in it, it tells you not to build near a swamp. He says, near a swamp, there grow certain minute creatures which cannot be seen by the eyes. They float through the air, he says, get into you through the mouth and nose and cause serious disease. And so he's describing germ theory before anybody knew what a microbe was. He's saying that that's what causes diseases and plant diseases and human diseases based on, the specific soil characteristics and, if it's close to a swamp, and then you have anaerobic soil, which has specific microorganism issues, but nobody would have a microscope to figure any of this out for another 1,600 years. I think the most important piece of all of these ancient texts, and what I'll close this video with, is Varro's quote on how to run field trials. I think it's a phenomenal quote. The most ancient farmers determined many of the practices by experiment. Their descendants, for the most part, by imitation. We ought to do both. Imitate others and attempt by experiment to do some things in a different way, following not chance, but some system. So the farmers from thousands of years ago were liming, they were cover cropping with legumes, and they were applying aged manure and increasing organic matter, and they understood microbial interactions in the soil in a way that modern science, now through the scientific method, we've come to understand. Know what people have done before, but don't just imitate. Do trials, figure out what works on your specific farm, and push the industry forward as we've been doing for thousands of years. And I thought it was so fascinating how from liming to organic matter to cover crops, like it's already been thought of, and modern science is leading us to those exact same conclusions I hope you enjoyed this video. I thought it was fascinating. My name is Jack Washburn, founder and CEO of the software company Cultra. The name of Cultra was Latin for cultura, or cultivate. We take all of the modern lab analyses from soil, tissue, soil microbiology tests, and we put them in one software so you can run your own field trials on your farm and see what's working and what's not working. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching.